Hello, everybody, and welcome to week 5. And in this week, instead of covering the content, which is set operators, I'm going to cover a little bit about how you can go about designing a database for those of you who are working on your final project. And it's just good to know for everybody else. If you wanted to learn a little bit about the set operators, I did put out a couple of videos on the quick bites that cover each one of those set operators in a little bit of detail to get you started. But if you have any questions, please feel free to let me know. But as I said, many of you have been asking questions about how do I go about designing my project? Because you said there's a lot of examples in the book, but the more examples would help. And which makes sense because there's a lot of different ways to solve problems, and every business situation is probably a little bit different. So to cover one of the more basic ones, I'm actually going to show you how to run a store. I'm gonna build a little bit of a database to run a store. So we're talking about products and pricings and those kinds of things. So I'm gonna build this in MySQL Workbench so that we can do it quickly and visualize it all at the same time. Feel free to build it however you would like when you're doing yours. But hopefully this gives you some ideas. So I'm going to come over here to File and select New Model. Now, as I'm doing this, I think it's important to note that I'm going to be taking some steps that I normally wouldn't do. Like I might put a column in a table and I might go back and fix it. I kind of already have an idea for how I would structure this in my head, but I also want to show everybody that it's okay to kind of be slightly iterative. And in fact, I kind of hope you are. I hope you're a little iterative so that as you're building this, you think, oh, maybe I should do something a little bit different and go back and fix it. So anyways, let's get started. I always like to kind of start off with kind of the base of what I'm doing. So in this case, if I'm building a store, my so-called base might be the product table. And so that's where I'm going to start. So I'm going to start by building a product table because that's what we're going to sell. We're going to sell some product. And for whatever yours may be, you can change your design, change your naming, whatever works for you. But I'm going to start with product. Let's go over here to our columns and let's start throwing in some of our columns here. And again, I'm not going to be exhaustive, but I do want to give you a good sense. So bear with me. Some of these might be a little longer than others, and some might exclude some information that you might want to add. So just something to think about. So I'm going to start with our product ID, set this to be the primary key, not null, so it can't be empty. And I always like to set mine to auto increment. So it's just one less thing that I have to worry about. Next, I'm going to give my product a name. And this is where we're going to start making a little bit of decisions about how our user interface might interact with this. In this case, a lot of times why you might restrict the length of a string or a varchar is based on what the UI can hold. And so in this case, I'm going to limit mine to be 60 characters. And the reason why that's actually kind of handy that you're building the user interface as well as the database is because then we can make determinations about, well, let's restrict this to 60 characters so that way we don't have to worry about anything longer when we build our user interface. Additionally, we might want to set this to be not null because we don't want someone to leave it empty because that just doesn't make a lot of sense to have a product that doesn't have a name. So we're going to go ahead and set the not null flag so we don't have to worry about having a product without a name. Let's keep going down the list here. Some other things we might want to add. We have a product ID. We have a name. Our store probably sells a lot of different stuff. So we might want a product type. Now I'm going to put product type in here. And our first initial thought might be, hey, let's make this a varchar so we can put kind of whatever we want there. But we're going to do one better. I'm actually going to make this a product type ID. So that way we can keep things uniform. And I'm actually going to make this an integer. which I will talk about in just a second, because we're going to make that an integer. We're also going to make it not nullable, So that way it has to be full. And at this point, I'm going to pause on product, and I'm actually going to go fill this table, this product type table, so we can populate it. And the product type table is going to hold things like, for example, let's say I sell clothing of all different types and styles. A product type might be pants. A product type might be shoes. It could be a lot of different things. So let's go ahead and start building this. And as we do it, I'm also going to talk about another situation that might arise. And I think we've all seen it before. So when we shop online, most of the time you kind of have menus that say like, oh, this is not only shoes, but it's men's shoes. Or, these aren't just pants, they're dress pants. And so you might have multiple kind of layers there. And we might think, hey, I've got to build like 3 different tables to achieve that hierarchy. But the answer can be a little bit more clever. And in this case, I'm going to demonstrate that just a little bit. So we're going to start off with just doing a product type ID. And I actually messed up. Let's go fix this because we just want this to be a product type. Product type. There we go. Product type ID. We don't care about this up the front. We're going to make that just be product type ID. Integer, auto increment as always. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to add another column here that's going to let us build hierarchy within this table. And so all I'm going to do is I'm going to make this column called parent ID. It's going to be an integer. And the key here is we want this to be nullable because our uppermost level, our top parents, are going to be null. And then the child will have parents, and we can stack that to get this hierarchy. Because, as we look things up, we can always get people's parents. Okay. So we're going to have our parent ID, and then we're going to give this just a name. And that way we kind of have it there. And I'm going to, again, limit this to be, I'm actually going to keep this right at 45 characters. That just seems to make sense to me. And I'm going to leave this as not null so that it can't be empty. And then the other thing that I always like to include in my databases is an active flag. And there's 2 different ways you can do this. Sometimes you can keep dates so you can see a historical record, but sometimes you just want to set them active or not. And in this case, I'm just going to set this active, and I'm going to set this to be a tiny int. And I believe that there was an issue last time that wouldn't let me do this. So I'm just going to set this to an integer. I'm going to set it to not null because you're either active or you're not. And in fact, I'm going to call this active flag. I always like to kind of label my flags as flags so that way it's either on or off. And these are great for checkboxes in user interfaces. And by default, I want this to be on. So I'm going to just put a 1 there. All right, let's leave that like that. Let's come over here to product, and I'm going to connect these 2 really fast. So I'm going to go to foreign keys. Let it name it for me, FK product key 1. And the reference table is the product type, and it connects to product type ID equals product type ID. And there we go. So now these 2 tables are connected. Let's make this a little bit bigger so we can kind of see all those columns. There we go. All right. There's our product type ID. Now, I'm going to real quick jump over to here, and just in Sequila, I'm going to really quick kind of replicate this kind of model, specifically for the product type table. So I'm going to say create table product type. Right, I'm going to kind of give it the same thing. I'm going to say product type ID, not null, or we want this to be an int, not int primary key auto underscore increment. What else did we have here? We had a parent ID, which was an int nullable. We had a name, which was a varchar 45, not null. And then we had an active flag. This is also kind of helpful because you kind of get to see it along the way. And in this case, just to show you what it would actually look like, I'm going to make this a tiny int, size 1, not null, default 1. Just like that. Now I'm going to add one more thing that we haven't done yet on the other side, which is our foreign key constraint. So I'm going to call this foreign key product type, give it a number 1. We're going to say foreign key parent ID. And we want this to reference itself. References, product type ID. Now, if this was a not null column, we would actually be stuck in kind of a conundrum because we wouldn't be able to actually insert any records until one existed. So, but because that's nullable, we can handle that. So real quick, just to show you what I'm doing here in the code, I'm going to come here to the product type table, add a foreign key, just like we did there. And this one's going to reference itself, and parent ID is going to reference the product type ID. And now you can see that there's this little arrow here where basically it says, hey, it can reference, not an individual row can't reference itself. I mean, technically it could, but we actually want it to reference another row in the same table, which I'm going to show you here in just a minute. So let's go ahead and run this. It looks like this doesn't like that. So let's actually, it looks like it says it's deprecated or something. We'll just switch it so it matches. So let's drop that table and let's recreate this one. But this time we're going to make this just an integer. There we go. That time we didn't get any warnings. And so now we have this product type table. So now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to insert some values. So I'm going to say insert into product type. And let's insert into parent ID, name, and that's actually all we need. It's pretty easy. Now we're going to say values. Now the first thing we're going to insert is our first parent. So let's just say that we want the first kind of level to be men's, right? So the product type is going to be men's. The parent ID is going to be null. And then we're going to make this men's. If you ever need to put a single quote inside of your stuff, you can always just double it up and it works. So we inserted that. Let's go ahead and select it. Select everything from product type. There it is. See, we have a product type is 1, product type ID is 1, and our parent ID is null, and we have a men's, and our active flag is set to 1. Perfect. So now I'm going to just take and copy this, and we are going to go ahead and insert a child. So what we're going to do is now we're going to insert, let's say, pants. Right? And now on our parent ID, we want to set this because they're men's pants. Like I said, we want this to be a child of men's. So what we're going to do is we could just put a 1 here, but I like to always build mine so they work no matter what. Because what if we insert women's first next time? So I like to do a subquery. So we're going to select parent ID from product type where name is equal to men's. Go ahead and run that. Oh, and I forgot that this is a problem because we can't select something from the same table at the moment. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're just going to substitute this with a 1 like it would be. In other database systems, that's not a problem. So now if we select everything from product type again, now we kind of have this kind of chain. Now I'm going to take this one step further before we bring it all full circle. And I'm going to select, or let's insert one more here. And this time we're going to not only have pants, but we're going to have dress pants. All right, so now we have quite a bit of data in. We have 3 records of data in here, which are all in a hierarchy, because we can see here that, um, you know, pants is parent ID 1, which is men's. So now we're going to kind of bring this full circle, and I'm actually going to select a single product type. In this case, I'm going to select dress whatever, and we're going to see what its parents are so we could see what the menu structure would look like. So let's get started. So if I wanted to do this, I would select, and let's just select everything for now, from product type. And I'm going to call this one R for root. Let's just start with there, and we're going to add a where clause and say where name. Now let's select the actual product ID, where r.product type ID is equal to 3. Well, there's our dress pants. And now we're going to add some layers to this. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to select r.name, and I'm going to select r.parent ID as parent. Right? There we go. So now we can see the parent. So now we're going to start adding some joins here. So I'm going to do an inner join. Actually, let's do a left join. Let's do a left join. And I'm going to select this from product type again. This time I'm going to call it the parent. We're going to do this on r.parent ID, just like our foreign key that we set up. r.parent ID equals the parent dot product type ID. And we can always look and see what that is, because we can see exactly what the relationship is. Parent ID in the root record is going to equal the product type ID of the parent. So now what we can do, we have our join defined, is we can select the parent dot name. As parent name. So now we can see, oh, the child is dress, its parent is number 2, and the parent name is pants. So now we're going to take this one step more, and we're going to get the grandfather, right? Product type, and I'm going to put a GF for grandfather. And this time, because I'm getting the parent's father, or the parent's parent, I'm going to connect it a little differently. I'm going to get parent dot parent ID is equal to the grandfather product type ID. So it's the same kind of structure of relationship. We're just moving one up. And now I'm going to add one more level here. So I'm actually going to say p dot parent ID as grandfather ID, and then gf.name, grandfather.name as grandfather name. And just so you know, I picked grandfather just because we're dealing with men's dress pants. And there we can see now we have a few different, we have our chain. And so if we were building this UI, this would be a great example. This would be a great CRUD example on how to populate a menu breadcrumb. Because what's cool is we could just take out this where clause, and all of a sudden we would have everybody's list. Because we could, instead of calling this parent name, we could call this, we could say as level 1. Or, yeah, really it's backwards. Let's call this level 3. Level 2. Actually, this would be level 2 ID, level... And We'll call this one level 1. So if we were kind of going to build like a menu structure and we wanted the relevant IDs so we could go to them, and this is just a little bit backwards, but yeah, we'll get the hint here. R.product type ID. There we go. So now if we were building our menu, we would just select these in the different order and we could have men's, pants, dress. You get the point. So that's kind of a good example of a CRUD statement on how to read if we were going to do this kind of thing to build a menu. And that's all because of this little self join here that makes that all possible. So that's kind of a cool little concept. So let's keep going with our design here. So we have our product. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a, let's say, price. You know, products have prices. So I'm going to call this a price, and I'm always like to set mine to be a decimal 15.2. Kind of like a well-known number format. And we kind of want all of our prices to have something. So by default, I'm going to set it to 0. Right, there we go. Cool. And then let's set active, let's say the start date. Because with products, sometimes, you know, we quit making a product. Pretty normal thing to do. So we are going to set a date. And, you know, let's get a little bit more granular and set a date time. That way, if we want to turn something off at, you know, let's say we're in the middle of the day and all of a sudden someone comes and says, hey, we're out of this thing. We need to turn it off. Well, we can just turn it off. We can set a, you know, a time to turn that off. So we're going to say start time. And then I'm actually going to set that to not null. Set the default to be current underscore timestamp, which will return the current timestamp of the server whenever we use it. So the end time. I'm going to set this to be a date time as well. Now on the end time, I'm going to leave it nullable because a lot of times we'll say, hey, we're going to sell this product, but we're going to sell it for the foreseeable future. So we don't know when we're going to quit. And I think the practice of putting a date in well in the future is weird and dirty. So we're going to leave that and it's just going to be null. Cool. So there's our product table. Now, the other thing that we might want to consider is our price. Prices change, right? And we haven't taken in consideration anything like taxes or anything like that. So what we might want to do is we might want to move price out. So I'm actually going to delete the price column because we want a way to track prices historically. Specifically because we might get audited by the IRS and they might want to say, hey, well, how much did you sell that that shoe for 10 years ago? Well, we're going to keep track of all that. So I'm just going to create a price table. We're going to just call it price. Let's gonna just give us a price ID. It's going to be an integer, primary key, auto increment. Okay, and then we're going to put a product ID. We're going to set this to be not null because there's no sense in having a price that doesn't have a product attached to it. And then the last thing that I'm going to put in is the amount. We could call it price, but I like to kind of say amount. And again, we're going to make this the same kind of style. So a decimal 15,2. And the 15,2 is just how many numbers before the period and how many after. We're going to set that to not null, just like we did before, and set the default amount to 0, 0. You'll notice that I'm not storing a figure, such as a dollar symbol. And we'll get to that in a minute. So let's set a start time and end time, just like our price, because we might want to change prices in the middle of a day, right? So let's set this to a date time. Again, we're going to set that not null. Set this equal to current timestamp. You'll see that kind of practice happen a lot. But this is how we can store things historically, which is really important. So like I talked about, currency. What type of currency is this? Because we have an amount and we don't want to store a figure with it because we might have to do math. Like, for example, calculate tax. So what can we do here? Well, in this case, let's actually create yet another table. And there's nothing wrong with having a lot of tables. You just want to have it be well thought out. You don't want tables just for the sake of having tables. And in this case, we're going to call this currency. And we're just going to have this be a currency ID. Auto increment. And we're going to give this a couple names. I'm going to give it actually a name. And I don't know if there's any that are over a varchar 45. So I'm not going to worry about it. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to put a symbol here because it might be useful for our people building the UI to just insert a symbol there and have it. So I'm going to put symbol there, and this one's going to be a varchar, let's just say 10. I don't know if, I think that's only one really. So let's just put one. I don't think there's any symbols that are more than one character in length. And we're going to set that to non-null. All right, so here's our currencies. Kind of have everything set up here. Now, let's say that we are based out of the US, right? Because we want to think ahead. We want to provide a way for maybe foreign customers to be able to see prices in their own format. So they don't have to do conversions by themselves. But really, all of our reporting, all of our financial reporting is going to be done in US dollars. So in that case, I'm actually going to kind of build in my conversion right here. And that conversion obviously can change. So actually, maybe it's best to leave it out. And again, I'm kind of thinking here on the fly, so we're just going to leave that out. Let's leave this as is for right now. I'm going to go back into my price table. If we did want to build in conversion, we're going to have to build another table with start dates and times and all that kind of stuff. So that way we can convert properly. Okay, to actually get it in what US dollars are, because most of the time we set our prices, and yeah, the US conversion might fluctuate a little bit, but we set our prices. Okay, so let's come here, and I'm going to add a currency ID. And I like to keep my IDs up at the top, and I'm not sure what happened there. Just copied the name and didn't actually copy the, there we go. Currency ID, this is going to be an int, and it's going to be not null, and I'm actually going to default this to 1 because I know I'm going to put US dollars in first eventually, and that'll save me some time. All right, so there's our price table. And now we just need to connect these. So in our foreign keys, I'm going to go ahead and first connect it to product. And then second, I'm going to connect it to currency. There we go. There's our price and our currency. So now we're getting somewhere. All right. Look, this looks pretty good. So we kind of have a way to track our products, our product type, and our prices. So now what we might want to do is we might want a way to, put products in a cart. But to do that, we kind of want maybe a user that we might tie it to. So that's what we're going to do next. Is I'm actually going to kind of shift gears just a little bit and kind of go over onto the other side of the spectrum, and we're going to look at the customers. So I'm going to go ahead and add a table, and I'm actually just going to call this table, let's call it a customer. Okay. Now, this is again where I kind of start to think a little bit and have to make some decisions along the way here. And I'm thinking in my head, well, how do customers log in? And I could just put an email and password here. But the real answer is that it might be more complicated than that. And if we're looking at the big picture, we're probably going to have staff or yourself that needs to log in and make changes to, because we probably don't want to change prices in the database. We'll probably build a tool that we can do that. Most online stores have an online interface for people to, adjust their prices on the back end. So rather than try to manage two sets of authentication, one for customers and one for system administrators, I'm actually going to build another table, and I'm going to just call this a system user. And it looks like I just renamed that one. So let's try here again. We're going to call that a system user. And this one's going to be a customer. There we go. Let's build our system user ID. And in this case, I'm just going to call it user ID, just for sake of being simple. This is where we can start putting some of that information, like an email. Set this to be non-null. We're going to set a password. And those, I like to set these to be max level varchar so we can hash our passwords. I'm going to give, for names, I like to give them a little bit of leeway, so we're going to put 60. I'm going to do created at with a date time. Set that equal to the current timestamp, so when we create something, it just kind of automatically puts it in there. And then we're also going to put, for security reasons, we're going to put modified at. Those are called who audit columns. Now, normally we'd put who it was audited by, but I'm not going to get that detailed for right now. So whenever the default is for whenever we insert a new record, it will put the default if one exists. And that means that we don't have to supply one, because whenever we create a record, obviously created at's going to be the current timestamp. But we want to keep track of that. So that way, if we want to know, oh, hey, when was this user created, we can go back and look. All right, that looks pretty good for right now. Let's just leave that just how it is. And actually, let's give it a role ID. So let's go ahead and add one more table. Because like I said, I like to plan for the future. And I'm going to build a role table. I'm actually going to call it a user role. And we are going to, and again, I did that same thing again. Let's go ahead and rename that back to system user. Let's remember to double click. We're going to call this user role. We're going to have a user role ID, which is our primary key auto increment. I'm going to give it a name. Varchar 45 should work. And I'm going to do an admin flag. And the admin flag basically determines can they administer or not the system. And by default, I'm going to put this as a 0 just for security reasons. Now inside of our system user table, I'm going to go back in here and we're going to add a role ID. Let's go ahead and move this role ID up here, because I like to keep my foreign keys all at the top. That is weird that it does that. but we will live with it. Gonna make that an integer. We're gonna make this not null, and the default is going to be a 1 because our default role is just going to be customer. Now we don't see that yet, but that's just what we're going to plan on. Now in our system user table, we are going to build our first constraint, which is to a role just like that. Role ID, perfect. And I'm actually going to make one small change here. Instead of calling this user role ID, we're just going to call it role ID just for the sake of being perfect. And that should change automatically. Great. There we go. So now we kind of have system users defined. Now what we want to do is we have a way to kind of determine if a system user is a customer, but I'm also going to have a customer table just to make sure that everything works correctly. And we kind of want some more information. Like we have when the user was created, but maybe we want a little bit more information about the customer. So let's go here in our customer table and let's flesh this out a little bit. For example, customers, we might want to have information like a first name. Again, I'll give them a little leeway on the name. 60 characters should be adequate. Then I'm going to do a middle name. Some people really like their middle names. And again, I make these 60. Middle names, not everyone has one, so you leave that nullable. And finally, a last name. And we're going to make sure they have a last name. We also might want to have a birth date, which can just be a date. We don't care about the time they were born. We're going to leave that nullable. Maybe they don't want to provide it. And this is where, again, we have to make decisions. Maybe we require it. Do we want to make sure that we're not selling products to a certain age? Those kind of things. And so, if so, we might want to require a birth date for legal reasons. And in fact, let's make that required. All right, so there's our customer. Now, a customer also needs to have a login. So we're going to add a user ID. I should have done this before because now we're going to move it up here, and it seems like that always has issues because it just copies the name, but not the rest of it. So we're going to call this, let's see, username, last name, and birth date. That's what we missed. There we go. All right, user ID cannot be null, and it needs to be an integer. All right, our foreign key is going to reference system user ID. And there we go. So now we have some customer information. And the reason why I put system user separate from a user or from customer, even though this is technically probably going to be a one-to-one mapping, it might be that someone's both a customer and an administrator, for example. And we might decide that we want to add more information. But really the main reason is that I want to be able to connect customer data to other things that we might not care to connect a system user to. For example, like a staff member who's in charge of shipping. We probably don't care that their account is tied to all this other information. Because another interesting concept that we're going to implement here is a cart. We want people to be able to buy things, obviously, and to do so, they need to put things in a cart. Now, one thing that's an interesting concept, me working in kind of a data field, is that data is very valuable. And one of the things to think about is we could just say, every user may have a cart, right? And a cart being what's currently do they have kind of loaded in at the time. But what's interesting is we also want to let guests shop without having to make an account, so to speak. So I am going to tie a customer here, but I am going to leave it nullable. And the reason being is that we might want to just track people to see what do people put in their cart, but not purchase. Or we just need to be able to save their cart. So I'm putting customer ID there, but that doesn't mean it's actually going to be full. And I guess I need to uncheck that because that's what we just talked about. Perfect. Now the other thing that I'm going to do here is I'm going to add another column because I have done some web development stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another column to kind of supplement customer ID. And I'm going to call this a guest identifier. And that could be anything like an IP address, something that we could kind of track a person with. It might be a session cookie. It might be whatever, but I'm just going to call it guest identifier so it makes sense without using technical terms. So normally this might be like a session identifier or something, but for now I'm just going to call it a guest identifier. And I'm going to make this nice and long because we don't know what kind of data type this is going to be at the moment, but its odds are it's going to be some sort of long string like a token. So I'm going to leave that a varchar 250. All right, so now we kind of have a way to track who this cart belongs to, which is great. And now what we're going to do is we might want to know when did they, well, we don't really care when they created the cart. Yeah, we do. Let's say created at. Now for customers, this is probably going to be the first time that they started. But the reason we want created at is because we want to know when guests created their data. So again, it's just important to kind of think about how you might want to use your data. So we're going to say created at datetime. And let's leave it just like that. And yeah, that looks great. All right. So there's a cart. Now we need to connect this. So let's go ahead and connect our cart to our customers. And that's simple. Now, one thing that I haven't really talked about are these kind of options over here. Whenever we create a foreign key connection, we have some options that, when certain things get updated, you can delete things, and when we delete. So for example, if we delete a customer, we probably don't care to keep their cart, or we want it to cascade, meaning because if I try to delete customer but they have a cart, it's going to throw an error and say, hey, you can't delete this because they have a cart, and if you delete it, then it'll just be a lost cart for the rest of forever. So if you say no action, it's going to throw an error, and that means you have to delete the cart, then the customer, which is there for safety reasons, right? But sometimes in certain cases, if you're willing to accept the risk, it might be worth it just to let it delete it for you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and say cascade, which basically means go ahead and delete the cart if it belongs to somebody. So if I delete the customer, it's going to subsequently also delete their cart. Okay, so now we have a cart, but now we need a way to get products in that cart. So I'm going to go ahead and build a cart product. Now, some things we might want to have in our cart product are obviously a primary key. Set that to auto increment. So now this is going to store individual products. So the next thing we obviously want is a product ID. Set that to not null. The next thing we might want is a quantity. Now this is, can they get more than, can they get like 1.5? Like maybe you sell like ounces. I don't know. But in this case, I'm just going to keep it as an integer data type because I'm not going to sell 1.5. So we're going to just say quantity is an integer and it has to be not null. By default, we're just going to say there's only one, but really most of the time, this is all going to be dependent on other things, but we're going to just say 1. All right. Cool. And now what I'm going to do is the other thing I want to do is I want to track, and this again is starting to get more on the complicated side, but think about how important it is as a business owner to know, like, oh, if someone puts something in their cart and then removes it, that might be insightful, especially in numbers. So, for example, let's say that, oh, 50% of our users put this in their cart but then removed it. And we might want to understand why, but we never get to that point if we never have the data to see that. So anytime someone puts something in their cart, we're going to track it. But that doesn't mean that when they remove it, we're going to delete the record. We're just not going to show it to the customer. So what we're going to do is we are going to put a remove flag. It's going to be an integer. We're going to set it to not null. We're going to default it to 0. And then I'm going to say removed at. We want to be able to track it. That would be a date time. And this is all pretty insightful stuff. Now, the other thing that we might want to have is we might want to have a added at. Because just as important as when they removed it, we might want to know when they added it. And because, like, for example, let's say that they, put, people orders things all at the same time. That could be insightful. So we have when they added it, if they removed it, and when. And then additionally, we might want to track if they purchased it or not. We're going to set this to 0 as well. Don't want that one. Added at can be empty. Actually, added at's the only one that we need filled. Because if it's here, it's obviously been added. So we want that one to be not null. But it may not have been removed and it may not have been purchased. So we're going to leave those empty. And then additionally, I'm going to put a helper flag in here. And let's think for a moment. If it's never been removed and it's never been purchased, then we know it's active. So I'm actually going to leave it just like that. Now, if you wanted to add a helper column, you could put an active flag in there, but it's not necessary because we can handle that logic when we do our select statement. So I'm not going to worry about that for right now. But if you wanted to add it just to make it a little simpler, there's, again, nothing wrong with that. I just try to keep everything to a minimum. All right, so here's our cart product. I'm going to connect this with our customer table. Or sorry, cart. Ooh, and I didn't even tie it to a cart. Let's go ahead and tie that to a cart. Where did it go? Let's go ahead and add our cart ID. Purchased at was that one. And our cart ID is going to be an integer. It's going to be not null. All right, does anyone see where that went? Is it behind this? I'm not sure. Did it delete? Interesting. I'm not quite sure where that went. Which is unfortunate because that was a lot. Let's see here. Interesting. I'm not sure where that one went. Anyways, we saw the basics, so what I'm going to do is just create a smaller version of that. So we're going to call this cart product. Let's see if it'll even let me make another one. It did, so I'm not sure what happened there, but we're just going to do a smaller version of this. So we're going to have that be cart product ID, and instead of tracking all that data, because we kind of kept tabs on that, I'm just going to have a cart ID and a product ID. So this will actually let me show you a smaller version. So if you just want to keep things simple, because maybe things just are a little too much for where you're at, there's absolutely nothing wrong with just deleting things when they buy them, because we will have their purchase history. We just won't be able to track if they didn't buy something from the cart. So what we're going to do is we are just going to put a we have the cart ID, the product ID. We're just going to say added at, and leave that as a date time. It'll get deleted eventually, but then we can at least see how old people's carts are. All right, so there is a cart product. Let's go ahead and connect this. It's going to connect to cart and cart ID. And again, on my on delete, I'm just going to set that to cascade. So that way, if someone deletes their cart, it deletes all the stuff inside of it as well. All right, so now what we want to do is also connect this to our products. And somewhere I do have a hidden table somewhere, missing in action. All right, now the other thing is if we delete a product, we probably want to delete it from people's carts. Probably not a very good practice, but we're going to do it. All right, so there is a, is that connected to product type? Product, there we go, product ID. Now we're connected to the right table, perfect. All right, And so the final piece to this puzzle is that we need a way to actually track purchases, because you'll notice that we kind of have the customer tied to the carts, but we don't really have our like orders. We don't have price anywhere. And the reason we don't put price in the cart is because prices can change. And unless you want to give people the deal they got when they put it in their cart, then so be it. But most of the time you kind of want the prices to adjust with as people put them in their cart. So let's go ahead and add another table here, and we are going to call this an order. And our order is going to consist of basically a customer ordering. So we're going to go ahead and put a customer ID here. Not null, obviously an integer. And our order is going to have a date, time. So we're going to say ordered at. So there's our date, time. Can't be empty. We're going to set that to be the current time. And then we kind of want to store some relevant information here. So what I'm going to do in this case is I'm going to say a total amount. Again, that's going to be our decimal 15.2, which will end up being the total sum of all of our product prices with the quantities, if that makes sense. So there we go. We have our decimal 15.2. We want that to be not null, and our default to be 0, just in case something happens, we at least have something there. So we have our total amount, and then we want our currency ID. Set that to be an integer, not null. We're going to default that to 1, just is US dollars. Cool. And I'm also going to give this a status, which really we would want this to be a status ID. So let's go ahead and put the status ID there. I'm not going to build the status table right now, but we might just want to assume that it's there. Let's give that a 1 status for unknown or something. All right, foreign key. First thing we're going to reference is our customer. Second thing we're going to reference, actually we don't have one, so let's just go ahead and delete that. All right, so there's an order. Customers can place orders. Now, again, you'll notice that we don't have products in there, and that's because we want to track a given order, and then we need to know what's in that order. So in this case, we're going to have an order product table. And you'll notice that like in a lot of the examples, it's like order has product. And I don't really like that naming convention. It just is weird to me. But you can do whatever you would like. I'll just say this: I've never seen it in real life, if that makes sense. But I think it helps mentally make sense. But just so you know, I usually like to just do an underscore. So the first thing we want to do is connect this to our order ID. It's going to be an integer. It is going to be not null. I'm glad that didn't save anything that I had done. Order ID. Int not null. And this is where we'll actually connect it to our product. And like I said, in case we ever get audited, we kind of want to know what the price was at the time of someone ordering. So this is also where we're going to have a price ID. And technically, we don't need to have product ID here. We could just have a price because it's connected to product. But it's good to have both just for convenience as much as anything. Because that way we have a full triangle. We're going to set that into not null as well. And the last thing we want is a quantity. I guess it's not the last thing because we had one more. Not null. Actually, you know, we could do like a subtotal, but we're not going to do that for right now. We're going to default the quantity to 1. All right, let's go ahead and add our foreign keys. This one has a lot. So the first thing we're going to do is our order. Next thing we're going to do is our product. And price. And that's getting a little squirrely. So what I'm going to do actually is pull these two down, pull our product type down here, get our price somewhere where it can be all bundled up there. There we go. Something like that. All right. So this kind of like brings everything together here. So now we can see that a customer can build a cart based on products. And really that's just a way to track for the customer, what's currently in their cart, preparing for an order. And then when they actually do submit an order, that goes through to create an actual order. We track what's in the order. So what's so what products are in the order, what price were they, and how many, right? And so that comes from price and all that kind of stuff. The last thing that we might want to add to our order is payment info. So I'm going to go ahead and add some of that information here. So let's go back to our columns. So we have a status. I'm going to do a payment type. Let's do an int and not null. Let's go ahead and add a couple columns, just a couple tables, just to kind of finish this all off. Payment type. It's an int, auto increment, give it a name, and if it's active or not. So something like Visa, MasterCard. Maybe we don't accept MasterCard at the time. Maybe we do. In fact, on this, we might want to actually just put a start date. On this one, instead of doing a start time and end time, I'm just going to do a start date and an end date. Because most of the time on these bigger kind of, we signed an agreement with a card company, usually just start on a date. There we go. There's our payment type. Let's go here in our order table and let's add a payment type ID. So now we're connected to a payment type, and we might want to store some information on our customer. We might want to store like customer payment. So like for Amazon, they let you store multiple kind of like gift cards, multiple cards. So we're going to say customer. Well, let's just call it a customer, not payment. Customer fund source. Now, if we only take credit card, we could just, call it something along those lines. But, maybe it's maybe we just link right to their bank account. Let's say they can give their fund source a name, which we require. We're going to default it to be my card. And we're going to say card number. And I don't know how long credit card numbers are off the top of my head, but just to keep things simple, we're going to do that. Oh, and we forgot customer ID. I'm going to just add one here so it doesn't mess things up like it seems to always try to. Oh, and of course, that's the first time it doesn't. Okay. Customer ID, and it references customer ID. And this is complaining because this is not an integer. There we go. There. Data types have to match. There we go. And now in our order, we're going to add a fund source ID, which will link to our customer fund source ID. There we go. Perfect. And that one will go somewhere right along there. Yeah, perfect. All right. Now, the only table that we didn't build is like our status, which might be like, it's shipping, or we're preparing your order, or awaiting payment, those kind of things. So you can kind of get the idea. But all in all, this is a pretty fleshed out solution here. And we can see this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 tables. So this is about the scope of what we would be looking at if we were building a final project. So I know a lot of people like to build, ordering things like web store databases. So I hope this helps. I also hope seeing the process a little bit got you a little bit in the mindset of like, oh, how might I build these different things? Like, for example, with the product type, building that hierarchy within a single table is really handy. But anyways, I hope this helps. From here, you can save this and we can actually have it generate some information. So we can actually forward engineer and have this generate all the code to create this, which I'm not going to do at this point in time, but it would be very helpful to you because it saves a lot of hand typing. But anyways, until next time, hope you guys have a great week. Let me know if you need anything.